Thank you all for being here today for the final Carla presentation of the semester. My name is Kate Paisani and I work at Carla. So today we are really pleased to welcome back Amanda Swearingen and Sam David, who are both in the second language education program here at the University of Minnesota. Amanda is a PhD candidate in the program and Sam is an assistant professor. And they are going to be talking to us today about harm and hope, reflexive conflicts and transformations in white pre-service teachers developing critical cultural awareness. Okay, Sam and Amanda, thanks for being here, and I turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you to all the folks at Carla for making this speaker series happen. We always really enjoy attending them and being a part of it. And it's been great to see how much interest and attention has been generated, especially since they've moved to this online space. I am just going to do a quick introduction and get out of the way because this work is really Amanda's work. She's an advanced doctoral student and my advisee, and has been with us for, I think, 5 years at this point, and for all of that time has been teaching a course on intercultural communication as part of our undergraduate minor, which is where this research is located. And I think it's really pushed her thinking on the whole notion of what it means to be an intercultural being in the world and what it means to train to work with pre-service teachers who are developing their own critical consciousness about their positions in the world and how they want to theorize their praxis as they move into the classroom. So without further ado, I will say thank you once again and pass it right on to Amanda.
Thank you, Sam. And I want to start by saying a huge thank you to Carla and the Carla community and family for their continued support of my work as a PI, but also Sam and I's work with translanguaging. For this particular project, I am focusing on my work, but I worked very closely with Sam over the summer as I was analyzing the data I had previously collected, and having his guidance and soundboarding for me was super helpful in my sense making of this project, because as Sam mentioned, this project is located within a course that I teach. And so I'm very intimately connected to all aspects of this course. And I'll get into a little bit of context in just a moment, but just to reiterate the title, we're looking at harm and hope, and this centers around the reflexive conflicts and the reflexive transformations that my white pre-service teachers experienced as they were negotiating the course on intercultural communication. And I'm looking at this particularly from a frame of critical cultural awareness. And so as Sam mentioned, my research broadly explores the intersection of critical intercultural communication and English language teacher education. And so I'm really interested in understanding how the intercultural within English language teaching is reframed from a critical paradigm and a critical ontology. And I think this is really important because most of what we see in English language teaching and English language teacher education are intercultural perspectives that come from more traditional paradigms that really foreground positivist and post-positivist leanings and conceptualizations of culture. And what happens is we have our teachers, our pre-service teachers, coming into language education with this idea of interculturality and culture that's really limited and constrained from these more traditional paradigms. And so they come in having really been apprenticed into teaching with their own experiences in their own language classrooms, where culture is really reduced to things like festivals and food and very tangible surface or visible cultural understandings. And so when they come into my classroom and I'm taking a much more critical approach that's foregrounding issues of power, justice, equity, and culture as a site of struggle, they're kind of shocked and they don't really know what to do with that information. And over the course of the past few years in teaching this, I've noticed that the more critical I get and the more critical the more critical perspectives I write directly into the curriculum, the more emotional my students are as they navigate that curriculum. And, they have these really critical moments of learning. And so I really want to understand, well, what are those moments of learning? And what does it really mean if we want to prepare language teachers who are critically conscious of who they are and their positions in the world in terms of critical interculturality? And what does that then mean when they are developing their own living theories of praxis that are grounded in sustaining and revitalizing pedagogies that are truly counter-hegemonic in their approach? And so that's kind of the setup to where I enter this course and the way that I'm talking with my students as they themselves are entering this course. So that's the general view. I'm going to be presenting on a snippet of that, mainly because there's so much going on and I don't know if I've made much sense of it overall. But for this, I was really interested in exactly how my students were reflecting on their experiences. And before I get more into that, I do want to give you a little bit more details on the course itself. So it is an undergraduate course, and it's hosted within our TESL undergraduate minor program. And like I said, I have spent the last several years designing the course curriculum, and some of the foundational work that I have put into this really comes from this idea that education is simultaneously a site of reproduction of inequity and a site for transformative change. And both of these, there's a symbiotic relationship with them. And we need to attend to both of these. If we only attend to the problems of reproduction without the possibilities of transformation, we're going to fall short. If we only focus on the possibilities for transformation without really uncovering the theoretical and real world implications of inequitable reproduction, then we're going to fall short. So the course itself looks at both of these angles and really draws in the connections between theory and praxis. So I already mentioned I draw heavily on critical intercultural studies and scholars that do that work. I also draw heavily on racial literacies, particularly the archaeology or arc of self by Yolanda Sili-Ruiz. And then most of my pedagogical approaches come from the framework of a critical pedagogy and dialogic pedagogy. And I do use participatory action research. Goodness, if I could talk today. Participatory action research and discourse analysis to really bring in that dialogic pedagogy. So in my course, over the course of the semester, we talk about the hegemony, the imperialism, and the coloniality that are associated with English and English language teaching. We talk about frames of native and non-native speakering. We do a lot of work with identities and really try to think through intersectionality in terms of identity. We talk about transculturality and globalization, particularly of language norms. We talk about things like erasure and silence, genocide. We talk a lot about race and the connection between race and language through sociolinguistic ideologies. We also talk, a lot of my students in the past have identified as queer. So we do a lot of talk and conversation around heteronormativity and transgendering in intercultural communication studies. There's been a lot of push in the research for this. Pedagogically, we talk about the importance of pedagogies of pain. And we do a lot of micro teachings, particularly around critical language awareness, translanguaging, CRT, and then critically culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy. So it is an introductory course. So they get kind of a breadth of topics, but the emphasis is always, always, always dig deep. Question, 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 question. I do this for myself. I model this, and I expect my students to do the same. So again, they come into this class kind of a little bit shell-shocked a lot of the times about what we're doing in the classroom. In terms of this particular study, I'm focusing on a particular iteration of my teaching of this, where the students came from a variety of majors within the university, and these range from linguistics, Spanish studies, elementary education, and then into sciences. I had one student who identified as Black, 2 as Asian American adoptees, 1 Chinese international student, and 14 white. And this is a relatively common racial and ethnic makeup of this course typically. All of the students except for 1 described themselves as English dominant, but all of the students had rather extensive histories of language learning themselves to varying degrees of proficiency. So I'm going to be focusing in this study on 2 particular teachers. And both of these teachers, or pre-service teachers, I should say, I had in a previous course, and then they enrolled in this course with me. So I had known them for a while at this point. And I chose them because they both are prototypical of sort of the experiences that I have noticed over the past several years with my pre-service teachers. And so the first case that I'm going to focus on, her name is Grace, and she is white, English. She is English dominant, but she is very proficient in Spanish. She is a Spanish studies major. She identifies as queer, and she was born here in the Midwest and planned to teach outside of the US. The other case I'm going to focus on is Holly. And she, just like Grace, was born in the Midwest, had planned to teach outside of the US. She identified as white. English was her mother tongue. She was a full polyglot, highly proficient in multiple languages, and was a linguistics major. And so I chose to focus on them because they both, like I said, are prototypical of a particular subset of my pre-service teachers. And they both entered the classroom fully engaged in the process of becoming a critical intercultural teacher scholar. So they really committed to this reflective work, and were really willing to ask themselves the hard questions, which fortunately most of my pre-service teachers do. But for them, that was something that I was looking at in terms of my choices for them. So again, I'm looking particularly at these 2 pre-service teachers from a framework of critical cultural awareness. In critical cultural awareness, the way that I'm using it, I'm using Guilherme's framework here. And she writes, it is a reflective, exploratory, dialogical, and active stance towards cultural knowledge and life that allows for dissonance, contradiction, and conflict, as well as for consensus, concurrence, and transformation. It is a cognitive and emotional endeavor that aims at individual and collective emancipation, social justice, and political commitment. And I've bolded these words, I added those bolds, because these are the elements that I really wanted to focus on in my analysis. I wanted to understand what types of dissonance and contradictions and conflicts my students were negotiating when they entered the classroom with prior sanitized understandings of interculturality, and then were confronted and faced several clashes theoretically and practically, with this more critical approach to interculturality. And the thing that I noticed is that there's a lot of change going on, and that a lot of this change is highly emotional. So that's my overarching framework. Within this, it is grounded in critical pedagogy. So there are nods, of course, to critical consciousness. And because I wanted to focus on white teachers in particular, pre-service teachers in particular, I do draw on critical whiteness studies in teacher education. So overall, that's how I'm approaching this project. And it is a case study that was descriptive in nature. I wanted to understand sort of this case portrait of Holly and Grace, and then what similarities and differences there were across both of their experiences. So the overall larger project included multiple reflections, but with these focal cases, I'm looking at 28 total weekly reflections. And the weekly reflections were done from the second week of the class all the way to the last week of the class. And except for the first reflection, all of them were open-ended. So the students could choose to write about whatever they wanted, whether it was related to our class content or not. And I would respond then to each of these. So it was more of a dialogue journal, but they were reflective in nature. And so I had all of these written reflections, and then I did an abductive coding process where I looked at my frameworks, and then I did some open coding, and I specifically used versus coding to identify different conflicts. So A versus B, to try to articulate or describe the nature of those conflicts. I also added emotional coding and then in vivo coding for things that I couldn't re-articulate well. So essentially, I analyzed these focal, reflective, written reflective pieces for my focal cases, and then I compared and contrasted those. All right, so getting to the meat of today's discussion, one of the things that I really, I went into this with a lot of expectations about what I might see. And it's a lot of times because I had seen themes be re-articulated again and again and again for multiple students across multiple iterations of the classroom. But as I was getting into the larger reflection of 250 reflection pieces, I started to notice that this concept of harm kept coming up. And it was something that I think I knew academically was there. I had expected students to talk about how, inequities inevitably lead to discrimination with real world impacts that are traumatic. And so I knew it was in the back of my head that it should be there, but I wasn't expecting there to be so much emphasis on this notion of harm. And so I really wanted to focus on that. And that also led to my choice of my focal cases, because they really articulated this consistently throughout the whole semester. In comparing Grace and Holly, both of them talked about harm, but they talked about harm in very different ways. And the impetus of harm for them was really quite different. And this really helps me understand my teaching, which is what I will talk about in terms of the implication. But with Grace, her emphasis was really on the classroom teacher as an individual in an individual classroom. She was concerned predominantly with her practice or what she might envision her practice to be in the future. And harm was very much a part of the discussion around what pedagogical choices she might choose to use in her classroom. And so for her, almost everything could cause harm, but it really became grounded in this notion of critical cultural awareness, this awareness piece versus the mastery of the practice. On the other hand, Holly was much less concerned with an individual teacher in an individual classroom. She was much more concerned with the nature of inequity at a societal or a macro level. So she talked a lot about systems of oppression, the way that her future students experience oppression, and how that oppression leads to both physical and symbolic violence. And so to give you a sense of this, Grace, again, was really thinking about this notion of awareness. And so for her, if a teacher is not aware, if she as a teacher is not aware of inequity, this is very harmful. She says here, part of being a critical teacher to me is to be brave enough to address these issues in class, to talk about racism, sexism, linguicism, colonization, etc., and not be blind to them, because that only perpetuates the issues and is harmful for your students. I feel like this is the premise to culturally responsive teaching, being actively anti-culturally blind and going out of your way to perhaps have the tough conversations, because without them, we don't get anywhere. And so again, if a teacher does not have this awareness, it could be very harmful. But on the back end, if a teacher does not have a masterful grasp of how to enact engaged pedagogy or equitable pedagogy or pedagogy for emancipation, however you want to classify it, then that is also equally harmful. And so she says things like, I worry that some social justice issues that I find important to discuss might be something I shouldn't tackle in the classroom because students may have contending views and it could create conflict. Additionally, from what I have experienced during volunteering in adult English language classrooms, sometimes students have these particular ideas about what a teacher is and how the classroom works, and any change to that is unwelcomed or welcomed but slowly. I, as a teacher, am unsure about trying to pave this new path for students. If they push back and it ends up flopping and they don't learn anything from it. She also says things like critical language awareness and honestly being a critical teacher in general sounds like a really big burden to take on. And I'm going to do it, or at least try, but I barely know what I'm doing when it comes to critical language awareness. How on earth am I going to try to teach something I haven't even come close to mastering? So for her, she was trying to understand the conflict between an awareness of the need to use equitable pedagogy and the ability to do that. And she never really solved any of that or came to any kind of resolution because she's a pre-service teacher. She doesn't know what it's like to be a teacher of record, and she won't know what it's like until well after she's left my classroom. And so for her, this idea of not wanting to harm her students sort of left her stagnant. And so, you know, she was developing this awareness, and she appreciated her developing awareness of critical interculturality and systems of oppression. But because she wasn't a master of that pedagogy, she sort of just left it there and said, you know, it is what it is right now, but I don't know how to move forward at this point. And so her emphasis on herself as an individual teacher in an individual classroom that she can only imagine at this point in her career really did not help her grapple with any kind of resolution. On the other hand, you have Holly, and as opposed to Grace, Holly was really interested in learning more about and talking more about the real harm that the world can enact on racialized bodies and linguistically diverse people. And so for her main conflict was the the institution of education versus society at that macro level in the treatment of language at that macro level. So she says things like, when an education system denies a language's very existence, children are harmed. When a jury does not believe a witness to be credible or blatantly does not understand the way she constructs time and intent, bodies are incarcerated. When a way of speaking makes you be perceived as unintelligent, criminal, or even merely disrespectful, careers are ruined and dreams are shattered. And so she felt a very intense sense of responsibility to the way that linguistic injustice actually has tangible and bodily harm, and as well as symbolic harm, and things become shattered when we don't attend to this. And so she's really focused on the real implications of racialization and linguistic injustice. And so Grace was more concerned with the classroom implications of these systems, but Holly, came out and really directly named the carceral treatment of Black and brown bodies and multilingual tongues. She also says things like, I think about my students and how they will be entering into the world with their English, and how the American justice system will fail them for having bad English. As a teacher, and if I teach in the US, most of my students will be persons of color. I have a responsibility to know what my students are getting into, to prepare them as best I can to manage it, and to work with them and other community members to change the situation for the better. It is effed up that our white society is so discriminatory that we don't even admit it, shifting the blame neatly onto those persons whom we have done our best to subjugate sempiternum, to subjugate always. So while Grace is again navigating the potential for her to cause harm as a teacher in her own classroom, Holly is articulating that education in an inequitable, say that 3 times, society must involve teachers who are willing to take the risks because the stakes are simply too high not to. Another difference is that Holly consistently reflected on the multiple stakeholders that are involved in enacting change. She wanted to work with her students, with her community members, in order to enact change. And this was a major difference in how Grace and Holly differently conceptualized or understood the potential of harm in an English language classroom. So again, Grace was really focused on herself as a teacher in her own classroom. And that's where the conversation stayed. But for Holly, because she was so focused on these larger systems of oppression, she inevitably just saw herself as one member of the whole of the resistance as a whole. And so there was a lot of negotiation that Holly was able to do because she wasn't alone. She wasn't solely responsible for instilling lessons of social justice in her classroom. She was a member of a part of a conversation, a community of practice that is committed to this work of social justice and linguistic justice. Excuse me. So this notion of harm really trickled down into a lot of their reflections. But they both also really had a lot to say and contend with this notion of native speakering and the racialization of English, particularly what it means to be an owner of English as somebody who is white and considered a native speaker. And so the next kind of set of conflicts that I'm going to talk about centers around this notion of whiteness, these notions of whiteness, native speakering, and standard American English. And both Grace and Holly connected these very closely to their identities as white women. And so when we started having these conversations in class about these topics, when they understood that whiteness and white supremacy is always tandem to conversations around linguistic justice. Both Grace and Holly began to question their reasons for even becoming or wanting to become English language teachers rather. And that became situated in their burgeoning understandings. Well, what does it really mean to be a teacher of the English language? And all the baggage that comes with being a teacher of the English language. And so Grace, began to reflect on her reasonings for becoming a teacher. And in doing so, became very embarrassed by her lack of awareness prior to the class. And so for her, she had thought, becoming an English language teacher is an easy way for her to find some kind of job in a Spanish-speaking country where she can make some money and at the same time beef up her Spanish so then she can return to the US to become a Spanish language teacher. And so she says something like, how selfish is it? I'm just going to read this quote. How selfish is it that I thought of language teaching so frivolously? I didn't have any grasp of linguicide and globalization and know anything about the history of teaching English. Is it selfish of me to move forward as a future teacher of English, now knowing what I do with the tools to think more critically about my actions? And so she really began to question, like, should I pursue this career, right? Like there's a lot more to it than I understood or than she understood. And is it ethical to keep moving in this direction now that she's aware of the coloniality of English, now that she's aware of linguistic discrimination and racial-linguistic ideologies? And so she questioned this a lot, similarly to Holly. Holly actually had feelings more in the line of hate and disgust. So she understood that she wanted to be a teacher of English, but she hated the feeling that she was merely furthering the spread of monolingualism and the power of English over other languages. Now, I should say at this point, Grace had initially before the class wanted to again go to a Spanish-speaking country and then return to the US to become a Spanish language teacher. She has since applied for a graduate program in teaching English. So she has ultimately come to this resolution that she wants to keep moving forward. Holly early on in the semester had already come to that resolution. So I think this is where you see why there's a difference in the types of emotional response. Grace is still embarrassed by not being aware. She's feeling like selfish. But Holly, understands this is what she's going to do. And she just hates that this is happening, but she's still going to do it. And so both of them struggled with reconciling their future teaching identities as both linguistic advocates and linguistic colonizers, particularly with regard to a concept that I've been toying around with called symbolic settlerism. And this is something that I conceptualize as these native English speaking teachers from these inner circle countries, the United States, Canada, et cetera, who immigrate to countries where English is not a dominant language, but the English as a lingua franca really drives the linguicide of local languages. And these teachers are aiding in this linguicism by the very nature of their physical bodies and language skills having been transplanted into these countries and classroom spaces. And this symbolic settlerism is a direct legacy of colonialism and a reinscription of the symbolic boundaries around good and bad, right? English speaking is good. Not speaking English is bad. Being a native speaker is good. Being a non-native speaker is bad. Being a white teacher of English, particularly American English, is good. Being a brown or Black speaker and user and teacher of English is bad. Being a non-native student, teacher of any ethnic background besides white European is bad. So there are constructions around good and bad that are reified in the very act of teachers, pre-service teachers, leaving their home countries and moving to another country. And this is something that I personally experienced in my own career. And it's something that I have thought quite a bit about. And I see the reflections in my white pre-service teachers very much in the same vein of how I had reflected on these things earlier on in my journey in critical interculturality. And so both Grace and Holly grappled with their identities as they related to the hegemony of English language and their roles as English language teachers. And so again, Grace focused predominantly in her reflective activity on this notion of linguistic advocacy and linguistic colonizer. And she continually questioned if she should still become that English language teacher. And again, this is tied to her identity. So she says, how can I, as a white, middle-class, native English speaker, someone who has benefited in every way from systems of power based on language, possibly take up this task of teaching someone English inside of the system that has disadvantaged or kept them from power? How can I possibly convey and hold on to the belief that every language is valuable, that every culture is valuable, and then head into my classroom and teach English? It feels so hypocritical. And this is something she returned to again and again and again. In connection to standard American English, as she tried to figure out a way to be okay with being both linguistic advocate and colonizer, she started massaging the possibilities for what she could do. And she continually landed on this idea of supporting students' needs and teaching for what would be beneficial to students. And this seemed to appease her at first until she continued to reflect and began to understand that, well, what do students actually need? Who gets to decide that? And so for her, not teaching to students' needs is harmful. But then when you add in this notion of academic success and social justice, it gets complicated, because teaching for student success is important, which means that not teaching for student success is harmful. And teaching for social justice is important, so not teaching for social justice is harmful. But she dichotomized academic success and education for equity. And so this became tied to standard academic English, where she recognized that her students do need English. They come to the classroom, they sacrifice time and money and energy, and oftentimes identity pieces in order to have access to English. And so that was really important for her. She says here, at the same time, how do I best help my students? Learning English in the US is unfortunately often necessary for success and communication. They will probably have more success from learning white upper class English because of the racism, xenophobia, etc., that permeates our society. But is that really in their best interest? How do I know what is helpful and what only perpetuates the idea of valuable or good English? And so teaching for social justice for her meant dismantling language hierarchies, having these discussions on racism and the connection between race and language. But she goes on to say later on in the semester, she knows, I know that telling someone they are articulate is not a compliment, but a microaggression. I know that policing grammar for students who speak non-standard dialects of English can be harmful and feeds into the power structure of language in the US. I understand the power of language, and I know that telling our students that their grammar is wrong or that they have to speak in a different dialect in the classroom feeds into power structures that are racist and xenophobic. And I know I can teach this to my students and teach them to think about the power of and in language, but does that really do anything helpful for them? And this was a major concern. And she never quite figures out how to resolve this conflict, where she has dichotomized students' needs for standard American English or standard English and academic success versus all the other social justice. So she felt and she reflected that teaching for social justice, particularly when she doesn't have mastery of it, somehow runs counter to success or students' access to success or opportunities for success. And so, whoopsies, I lost my place here. So she wanted her students to have, this access. And so again, she's trying to massage, well, how can she, resolve this kind of conflict? And so she says here, I always try to remind myself that different classrooms and different students will have different needs. It might be easier or more beneficial to teach non-standard language in an adult learner classroom, where they will be using English in places like restaurants, grocery stores, places where they will encounter non-standard dialects, versus teaching non-standard dialects in a high school or pre-college prep class where they're learning English for academic use. In this way, it depends on the classroom, but if that is how we determine what dialects of English are taught, we are still playing into the power structures that keep standard white English in power and other dialects out of it. But if we reject that and teach the pre-college learners non-standard dialects, we are potentially harming them and keeping them out of power, which still reinforces the structures, racism and colonialism. It's a double-edged sword, and there's no way around it without either hurting the students in the long term or short term. So again, for Grace, teaching for social justice had a lot of risks, and there was so much potential in her mind for causing harm. For Holly, her main conflict with regard to her whiteness and her mother tongue and the construction of standard American English really came down to this conflict between her compassionate conservatism and her desire to actively engage in advocacy for linguistic justice. And so she confronted her identity, but she really couldn't move past her position as this symbolic settler. Or she didn't feel the need to move past that because it would always be part of her identity. And so she would always be both an advocate and a colonizer. And she understood that there was no way around that. So she says things like, we privileged white folk send our children to middle school and are so proud when they learn to say, hola, me llamo, como te llamas? Why do we get the right to leverage our birth tongue and our bilingual status? And oh, how little it takes to claim this when non-English speakers need to cut out their tongue to graft in this language of whitewashing. And so she understood how her whiteness was tied to these acts of violence, and both physical and symbolic. She goes on to say, with the events that have been happening around the Derek Chauvin trial, the shooting of Dante Wright, and the shooting of Adam Toledo, I have had to face the fact that I am privileged to be able to ignore these atrocities. Being white, I do not have to think about them unless I choose to, how distant I can choose to hold myself. The system is set up to attack people of color, from prenatal to school to adulthood. The systems are designed to fail the BIPOC community. I can ignore the issues facing students, which is a privilege that I have and need to reckon with to be able to truly teach in a supportive and universal way. So as Holly was negotiating her understanding of these macro systems of inequity and oppression, and the realization that by being white and being an English mother tongue speaker, she will naturally always be in that position of advocate and colonizer. She began to understand that in order to be okay with all of this in an English language classroom, she needs to understand that she has to take an active role in advocacy. So whereas Grace was really concerned with consciousness and awareness, again, we see Holly here thinking about implications and action. And here, again, the conflict between standard American English and linguistic pluralism was always at the forefront for Holly. She says, I will teach English as another tool in my students' metaphorical belts, something they can use to advocate for themselves, their communities, and their cultures. And I will teach English in the global critical context of power and control, because English is not the best language. English is not the only language. English does not equal civilized. So for Holly, her emphasis was bringing in a lot of her linguistic background and taking a much more descriptive approach. So it wasn't up to her to determine what is the good language or the bad language, but rather to foreground the need to add or consider all languages, named or otherwise, as valid. I'm going to move here to get into this harm and hope talk. So just to recap here, Grace was very much focused on the classroom and the potential for causing harm in her future classroom, and she often juxtaposed this with her ideas for teaching what is beneficial for students. For her, being a teacher who is unaware of systemic oppression is harmful, but it's equally harmful to be a teacher who's not mastered any kind of critical approach to teaching. Further, for Grace, it is harmful not to teach to students' needs, and they very much need access to English and standard English. And so denying these needs for Grace is very harmful. And so she struggled with these multiple layers of teacher awareness, teacher skills, and student needs without ever coming to any kind of form of resolution at a classroom level. And this was very frustrating for her because her whole semester she spent talking about the classroom, the teaching, the classroom. And so not to be able to have a resolution, I think for her was pretty disappointing. But overall, her transformation came in with this notion of intercultural neutrality and intercultural politics. And so she left the course with a sense that classrooms are not these neutral spaces that she had previously thought. But she also never really situated classrooms within conversations at the macro level with these macro systems of oppression, as well as within communities of resistance. And so she couldn't ever figure out what her role was in terms of critical interculturality. And so her struggle, like her ultimate struggle, was that she envisioned the impetus of social work to lie again with that individual teacher in an individual classroom. And she had hope in her ability to continue confronting her personal biases, but she never developed a hope in her ability to enact change. And this was really important because she couldn't connect herself as part of a larger resistance. And so she thought, ultimately, if the risks of doing harm are so great and the probability of enacting change at an individual level is so low, then what's the point? For Holly, again, her focus was on fighting the system and of confronting the system at a macro level. And so she was drawn to those discussions around linguistic imperialism, language loss, ethnocentrism, and epistemicide. And the impetus of harm for her was in these systems of oppression, of which she, as a dominant identity member, will always be in a position of both reifying and countering. And so for her, it was really important to have those connections to these larger communities and to recognize that the students are experiencing real trauma from being part of these systems, and denying any kind of search for change or transformation within a classroom is unacceptable. And so there needs to be this collective activism. So ultimately, Grace got stuck in her white guilt and white shame, and it led to a lot of silence and immobility. But Holly really embraced her desire and need and this fundamental ethical need to dismantle white supremacy, to be this race traitor, to engage in abolitionism in the classroom. And so I will end with just a quick implication here. For me as a teacher educator, I'm interested in what are the reflexive scaffolds I can do to get my pre-service teachers to move forward. So again, Grace was focused on the individual in the classroom. She didn't make those connections to the macro level. So as a teacher educator, I want to facilitate that. I want to start where she's at, figure out what is missing and push, 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 push. The same thing with Holly. She had this intense ethical dispositional need, but she couldn't ever really articulate what might that actually look like in a classroom. So as a teacher educator for a student like her, I would want to push her to think about how does the theory, how does the macro understanding of things trickle down into your pedagogical decisions. And for both cases, emotionally, it's important to recognize and support emotions, but only when those are tied to critical reflection and moves for change. If they remain in the scope of guilt, that becomes immobilization. These are the types of emotions that we as teacher educators need to really push against. So I'll leave it at that and open things up to some discussion. I see a lot in the chat, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Amanda. Every time you give a talk, I learn something new, and I also am able to think about my own research in broader and different ways. So I really appreciate this. And I think that some of the issues that you pointed out with your participants reflect some of the work in general teacher education literature, the kinds of dichotomies that you point out, and the sort of desire to master their topic, but putting this critical cultural awareness lens on it, I think, is such a wonderful contribution. So thank you. So there is one question in the chat from Yi Li, and they ask about whether or not Grace and Holly might be at different stages in their professional learning as teachers. I know they're both pre-service teachers. Yi Li is suggesting that maybe Holly might have some teaching experience, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so actually Grace had more classroom experience than Holly. And I think, one of the reasons why I always push back against intercultural developmental models is because it's not so clean cut, right? And so I think in terms of intercultural awareness, they had differing levels of awareness depending on the context. So I think because Holly's awareness was tied so much to these macro systems that really infiltrate everything we do, I think in an initial level idea of thinking, I think somebody who's reflecting in that way will always appear to be kind of more culturally or interculturally sensitive or aware or have greater knowledges. But Grace had a lot of knowledge about or a lot of thoughts on the kind of teacher she wanted to be. And so when I think if I were to place them on a scale, I think it would be natural to say that Holly is sort of more advanced. But I think the negotiations they were having reflexively were equally nuanced. It was just the content of those were a little bit different. And so, I think if as a teacher educator, if I'm having a conversation with Grace, it would be easier to have a conversation about the classroom than it would with Holly, but it would be easier to have a conversation with Holly about macro systems and society than it would with Grace. So I think it's a give and take.
Thanks, Amanda. So there's a question that came in from Soria that's really interesting. And Soria, I'm going to sort of paraphrase or cut down a little bit what you've written. I think Amanda and Sam can read the beginning, but Soria's question, and this person is coming to us as a an educator of color, that educators of color often endure microaggressions whenever they enter a majority white English dominant classroom. And so the question is, sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase, I'm having a hard time. My question then lies in the experience of the minoritized folks in your classes. So I know you had we weren't just dealing with white students in your class. What is it like for them to navigate these conversations that you had? While these critical conversations are necessary, how do they address the ongoing trauma inflicted on folks of color? Sorry, it took me so long to get to that.
Yes. So I'm, as a white teacher educator, this is something that I constantly think about. And for me, I can't speak to those types of lived experiences. And so the way that I set up my classroom is to bring in community building, and talk explicitly about building brave spaces in the classroom. And I make it very clear that this reflective work is their own work. It's ungraded. And so I try to scaffold ways that I would hope my pre-service teachers with our commitment to community would use the opportunity to reflect on. But I can't ever be sure because I am a white English dominant pre-service teacher. I cannot be sure if they're using the reflective space in a way that speaks to that transparently and honestly, or if they're saying things in awareness of who I am in my own positionality. For what I have noticed in my analysis of the reflection work with my pre-service teachers of color is that they do tend to talk and share stories. So we do a lot of story circle work. We do a lot of different creative identity work, and they tend to talk a lot about their feelings of that. And so I think the scope of the emotional impact of the critical cultural awareness is fundamentally different. And I think the type of dissonance and the type of conflicts are fundamentally different. But I do see, in my white pre-service teachers, particularly those who identify with LGBTQ plus community, there are negotiations of understanding of intersectionality. And so I think, I am not prepared to sort of place themes around what I've noticed in my analysis with my pre-service teachers of color, but it is definitely different, and it's definitely more raw. But again, just as nuanced. I don't know if that is a satisfying answer, to be honest.
It was a tough question. It's a very difficult situation. So thank you for tackling it. But it's something that, I teach in a place that has a similar demographic as your classrooms. And so I was just hoping to bring it to the conversation because I see my students of color struggle, and I see that they're often lonely onlys. And so I just was hoping to have a conversation, but I do thank you for the presentation.
Yes. And I actually would like to continue that conversation if you reach out to me, because I do think the community building work, the responses I get from my pre-service teachers of color about their experience in the class overall are generally extremely positive, and they talk about how they learned way more about themselves than they expected to. I don't know how that situates in, but I would be very interested in talking more because I myself want to learn more as well. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Soria. As a white teacher educator, I also struggle with the questions that you asked. And so I appreciate that you brought this up. And I appreciate Amanda's work in this area and her answer to the question. So we are at the top of the hour. I know there are lots more questions in the chat. So Amanda, we can save the chat if you want to have a look at those. And I apologize to those of you whose questions we did not have time to answer. But we are so grateful that you all came today, and we are grateful to Amanda for her excellent and inspiring research, and to Sam for helping provide guidance for that research. So thank you all, and we hope to see you next semester for the Carla presentation series.
Thank you.